On the morning Riddle Creek finally went dry, Martha Bell was standing in the middle of it with a shovel, a milk pail turned upside down for a seat, and 31 cows bawling behind the barn. Her neighbor Earl Pritchard slowed his pickup on the county road because there was nothing else worth stopping for. "Martha," he called out, "you can't dig water out of a dry creek." Martha didn't look up. She set the shovel blade against a half-buried circle of stone the drought had uncovered overnight and set it quiet enough that Earl almost missed it. "I don't think this is the creek." It was the third week of July, 1988. Nebraska and Kansas were both drying out that year the same way the rest of the country was. Martha had heard on the radio that corn production nationwide was expected to fall by more than a third. She didn't need the radio to tell her that. She could see it in her own pastures. Martha was 52. Her husband Samuel had died in 1985, 3 years before that summer, and she'd kept the dairy going after him because the milk check was the one piece of money that showed up every 2 weeks no matter what the weather did. She ran 31 milking cows and 18 heifers on 140 acres, and Riddle Creek cut along the edge of the place, the boundary between her ground and Earl's. Nobody in Prairie Hollow thought much of Riddle Creek. It flooded in the spring, muddy and wide, and by the middle of most summers it was nothing but a cracked seam of gravel. The county map filed it as seasonal drainage. Earl had a line he liked to use about it at the feed store. "That creek doesn't run when you need water. It only runs when you already have too much." He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was being accurate, and everybody laughed because it was true. The problem that July was that true didn't fill a stock tank. Martha's domestic well at the house had slowed to a trickle that could barely keep the kitchen and half the barn going. Her cows needed close to 1,000 gallons a day in the heat, more on the worst afternoons, and Dale Crowder, who ran the water truck out of Prairie Hollow, told her over the phone that he was already booked 2 days out. $48 a load, Dale said. 1,000 gallons a load. "I've got 14 farms ahead of you this week, Martha." Everybody's creek quit at the same time. She called the bank the same afternoon. Roy Meeker had handled the Bell account since before Samuel died, and he wasn't unkind about it, just plain. "A seasonal creek doesn't help your borrowing base," he said, "not unless it holds water when the county's dry. Right now, on paper, you've got a domestic well that's failing and 31 cows that need water it can't give them. I'd think hard about trimming the herd before you're forced to." Her daughter Clara said much the same thing that weekend, though it came out softer and it hurt more for that. Clara was 24, a nurse in town, and she drove out most Saturdays that summer to check on her mother. She found Martha at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a coffee gone cold. "Mom, sell 10 cows. Buy yourself some time before you have to sell 20. "That's what everybody does when they run out of water," Martha said. "I'm trying to find out if we really did." Clara didn't argue further. She'd said her piece the way she always did, and she left the rest to Martha, the way Martha had always left things to Samuel, and the way Samuel had always left things to the ground itself. Martha had a notebook from the co-op, the kind meant for feed orders, and she'd started using the back pages for something else. She wrote down creek depth. She wrote down which fence posts the cows stood near longest in the heat of the afternoon. She wrote down the price of a load of water and the number of loads she thought she'd need before September. She didn't know yet what she was building toward. She only knew that a woman who wrote things down had something to look back at later, and a woman who didn't had nothing but memory, which goes soft in a drought same as everything else. It was on one of those mornings, walking the dry bed of Riddle Creek with the cows already restless behind her, that she noticed 3 things that didn't belong. The first was a patch of moss, dark and damp-looking, clinging to the shaded side of an old cottonwood root at a bend in the creek where the water should have been long gone by any reasonable account. The second was a stand of cattails at that same bend that hadn't gone the color of straw the way every other cattail in the county had. The third was the cows. Every afternoon, without anybody driving them there, they crossed the pasture and stood at an old crossing near the fence line, a spot where the county road used to run before it was moved decades back. There was no water on the surface there. They stood anyway, the way cattle will stand somewhere they remember water being, even after the water's gone. Martha didn't say anything about it to Earl, or to Clara, or to Roy Meeker. She went back the next morning with the fence probe rod she kept in the truck bed, the same rod Samuel had used to check post depth for 30 years. Outside the damp bend, the rod hit dry, packed gravel at 10 inches. She had to lean her whole weight on it. Inside the bend, at the old crossing, the rod went down 22 inches before it stopped, and when she pulled it back up, the last few inches were dark with cold, wet mud. She stood there a while with the rod in her hand. That night, she went looking through the tin box Samuel had kept in the barn office, the one with the old receipts and the deed copies, and the things he'd never gotten around to throwing out. Near the bottom, folded small, was a note in his handwriting she'd never noticed before, or had noticed and never understood. If Riddle ever dries clear to the crossing, look for the ring. She read it twice. She had no idea what a ring meant on a creek bed, but she had learned enough from 30 years of marriage to a farmer to know that Samuel didn't write things down unless they mattered, and he didn't explain himself unless somebody asked while he was still alive to answer. The next day, she drove into the county seat and found Henry Wills, 78 years old, retired from the surveyor's office, but still willing to pull an old plat map out of a drawer for anybody who asked politely. Henry recognized the name the moment she said it. "Bell Crossing," he said. "Your husband's people. That was a hand-dug well, put in for teamsters and cattle drives, way back before the road moved in 1936. There was a flood in 47 that changed the channel and buried the whole crossing under silt. Far as I know, nobody's touched it since." He found the map, a 1912 plat with a small circle marked Bell Crossing Well, hand-dug, teamster water, stone curb. Sitting almost exactly where Martha's cows had been standing every afternoon that summer. She drove home with the map on the seat beside her and started digging the following morning. Word got around fast in a place the size of Prairie Hollow. By the end of the first week, men at the feed store had a line about it, the same way they'd had a line about the creek. "Martha's out there, digging in a dry creek bed," somebody said. "Digging for what? Rain?" Earl drove by twice that week and didn't bother stopping either time, though he slowed down enough to shake his head through the windshield. Martha still had to buy feed, drought or not, and the feed store in Prairie Hollow was where the county did most of its talking. A man named Vernon Castell was leaning against the counter when she came in for mineral tubs, and he didn't wait for an invitation. "Heard you found yourself a rock pile out there, Martha," Vernon said. "County's going to want to know if you're planning on drilling a rock quarry instead of a dairy." A couple of the other men laughed, not unkindly, the way men laugh at something that costs them nothing. "It's not a rock pile," Martha said. "It's a well. It's a hole with wet dirt in it," Vernon said. "Same as half the ditches in this county after a rain. Doesn't make it a well." Martha paid for the tubs and didn't argue the point further. She'd learned that arguing with a man at a feed store counter never changed his mind, and it cost her time she didn't have to spend on convincing anybody of anything before she had the numbers to back it up. The digging itself was nothing like she'd pictured. The creek bed gravel had packed down hard as pavement in places, and the shovel bounced back at her more than once. The heat index stayed over 100 most afternoons. Her cow's milk production had already started slipping, a little more every few days, the way it does when animals are hot and thirsty, and there's nothing anybody can do about the thermometer. Clara came out on a Wednesday and found her mother red-faced and soaked through in the bottom of the creek bed. "Mom, this isn't worth a heat stroke." "I'm not trying to find water for us," Martha said. "I'm trying to find out if we already had some and forgot." On the third day of digging, the shovel struck something that wasn't gravel. She cleared around it with her hands and found the edge of hand-laid limestone, fitted without mortar, curving in a shape that was unmistakably a ring, about 4 feet across. She didn't shout. She didn't run for the phone. She sat back on her heels at the edge of it for a long moment, the way a person sits with something they'd half expected and half doubted at the same time. She found an old wrench in the truck bed and tied it to a length of baling twine, then lowered it down through the gap in the stones. It fell 9 feet before she felt it stop. When she pulled it back up, the last 6 inches of twine were cold and wet. She wrote it down that same evening, the way she'd written everything else that summer. July 22, stone ring, water at 9 feet, not creek water. The county sanitarian came out a few days later at Martha's request and warned her, fairly, that anything sitting inside an old creek channel needed testing before it went anywhere near a household tap. Martha wasn't after drinking water for the house. She wanted it for the herd, and that changed what needed doing. Over the following 2 weeks, she cleared silt out of the shaft with a bucket and rope, working a little each morning before the heat got bad. She set temporary wood cribbing around the stone curb so it wouldn't collapse while she worked. She had the county run a water test, which came back clean enough for livestock use. She packed a gravel and sand filter layer at the base, picked up a used hand pump for $165, and ran $92 of half-inch polyline from the well to the nearest stock tank in the lower pasture. She fenced the well itself with woven wire so no calf would ever step through the curb by accident. Total cost for all of it came to just under $700. The first overnight recharge test came back at 70 gallons. Not much. Enough to notice, not enough to matter yet. She kept clearing silt, and a week later found what looked like a lateral seam where water was moving in sideways through the gravel, not just pooling from below. Once she opened that up, the overnight recharge climbed to 210 gallons, and within another 10 days it settled around 620 gallons a day, steady. It wasn't enough to run the whole herd without help. She knew that going in. But paired with rationing and a reduced hauling schedule, it was enough to change the math. It hadn't gone smoothly the whole way through. 9 days into the silt work, one side of the temporary cribbing shifted after a night of heavy runoff from a storm that dropped rain everywhere except where the crops needed it. Martha came out that morning to find 2 of the boards leaning inward and a fresh slide of gravel half filling the shaft she'd spent a week clearing. She lost 3 days rebuilding the cribbing heavier than before, bracing it with old fence posts. Samuel had left stacked behind the barn, and she spent another $40 on lumber she hadn't budgeted for. She wrote that down too, the way she wrote down everything else, because a woman keeping honest numbers doesn't leave out the part where the hole caved in. Clara heard about the cave-in before Martha got around to telling her the way news traveled in Prairie Hollow, whether you wanted it to or not. See, Mom, this is what I mean. It's not safe, and it's not working. It caved in because I didn't brace it heavy enough the first time, Martha said. That's not the well failing. That's me learning how to build a well. Clara didn't have an answer for that one, and she didn't bring up selling the herd again for the rest of that visit. August brought the worst of the drought. Water restrictions tightened across the county. Earl started hauling for his own herd for the first time in years he could remember. $48 a load, same as everybody. Milk production dropped across most of Prairie Hollow, not just on Martha's place. Martha's herd felt it too. Milk was down about 12% that month. But instead of a truck coming every single day, she needed one roughly every 5 or 6 days, the old well covering the rest. Earl drove past on one of the hottest afternoons of the month and saw the stock tank in the lower pasture slowly filling from the thin polyline running out of the fenced-off well. He stopped his truck this time. "That's not much water," he said. "It's enough water," Martha said. By the end of September, the worst of the drought had broken. Martha had kept all 31 milking cows and all 18 heifers through 42 days of water restriction without a single sale. Milk production recovered close to normal by early October. She figured she'd avoided somewhere between $2,400 and $3,600 in hauling costs she would otherwise have paid, on top of whatever she would have lost selling cows into a drought market at the bottom of the price cycle. When her operating note came up for its annual review that winter, Roy Meeker sent an appraiser out to walk the property, the same as he would for any renewal. She showed him the well, the fencing, the poly line, the water test results, and the recharge numbers she'd tracked in the notebook all summer. The new appraisal didn't call Riddle Creek a seasonal drainage with no reliable water. It listed the old crossing well as a documented secondary livestock water source. The note renewed that winter without the conversation about the herd that Martha had been bracing for since July. Earl came by the following spring with a rolled-up county map under his arm, the kind Henry Wills kept filed away by the dozen. "Henry says there used to be a crossing on my west pasture too," he said. "Same era, same kind of well, maybe." Martha looked at the map for a minute before she answered. "Then we should walk it before it rains." Clara stopped by that same week, off shift early for once, and found her mother and Earl bent over the rolled-out map on the tailgate of Earl's truck. She'd spent the whole drought certain her mother was chasing something that wasn't there, and she said as much, standing off to the side with her arms crossed. "I still don't understand how you knew," Clara said. "Dad never told you where it was. Nobody told you." "Nobody had to tell me," Martha said. "The ground told me. I just had to be out there enough mornings to hear it." Clara didn't have a quick answer to that, either. She looked out at the lower pasture, at the stock tank still catching its slow, steady line of water, and for the first time all summer she didn't say anything about selling cows. Nobody in Prairie Hollow ever apologized to Martha for laughing at her that July. There wasn't much reason they should have. The creek really had been dry most summers. The bank had been right that a seasonal drainage couldn't be counted on. An appraiser looking at that ground from the road in a normal year would have had no reason to think there was anything under the gravel worth walking out to find. The difference was that Martha had walked out anyway, before she knew for certain there was anything there, because a note in a dead man's handwriting and a strip of moss that wouldn't die told her it was worth the trouble of finding out. The creek had not failed her. It had finally gotten dry enough to tell the truth. If you're finding these useful, there's a subscribe button below. One decision a week, with the real numbers. Earl said it wasn't much water. Martha said it was enough. Would you have kept digging in a creek everybody told you was dead?